There's a pattern most of us live by without even knowing it exists. We wake up, go through our days, interact with people, make decisions, and all the while something invisible is pulling the strings. Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and what he discovered about this hidden force is nothing short of revolutionary. He called it many things throughout his work, but today we're going to explore what might be his most unsettling revelation: the mental habit that quietly dismantles your life while you remain completely unaware. This isn't about motivation or positive thinking. This is about something far deeper, something that lives in the basement of your mind and controls more of your behavior than you'd ever want to admit. Let me start with a story. There was a man Jung worked with, a successful professional in his 40s, who came to therapy not because his life was falling apart, but because despite all his achievements, he felt hollow. He had the career, the family, the respect, yet every morning he woke up with a sense of dread he couldn't explain. Through their sessions, Jung uncovered something startling. This man had spent his entire adult life becoming exactly what his father wanted him to be. Not consciously, mind you. He genuinely believed these were his own choices, his own desires. But deep in his unconscious, he was still that little boy seeking approval, and every decision he made was filtered through that invisible lens. His true self, his authentic desires and talents, had been buried so deep he didn't even know they existed anymore. This is what Jung called living from the persona, and it's one of the most dangerous mental habits a human being can develop. Jung wrote extensively about the persona in his work, particularly in 2 essays on analytical psychology and the relations between the ego and the unconscious. He described the persona as the mask we wear to meet the demands of society, the role we play in the social theater of life. Now, having a persona isn't the problem. We all need one. The problem begins when you forget you're wearing a mask. When the persona becomes so rigid, so identified with who you think you are, that you lose touch with everything underneath it. Jung said, and I'm quoting directly here, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual." Think about that for a moment. Designed to make an impression and to conceal your true nature. When was the last time you did something purely because you wanted to, not because it fit the image you're supposed to maintain? Here's where it gets really interesting and a bit uncomfortable. Jung discovered that the stronger your identification with the persona, the more cut off you become from your shadow. The shadow is everything you've rejected about yourself, all the traits and impulses you've deemed unacceptable. And here's the brutal truth: whatever you refuse to acknowledge in yourself doesn't just disappear. It gains power in the darkness. It starts running your life from behind the scenes. You become a puppet to the very things you're trying to deny. Jung observed this pattern over and over in his clinical practice. People would come in with anxiety, depression, relationship problems, and when he dug deeper, he'd find this split. The acceptable self on the surface and the rejected self underneath, sabotaging everything. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. Imagine someone who prides themselves on being kind, patient, and understanding. That's their persona, their social identity. But underneath, they have perfectly natural feelings of anger, frustration, and judgment that they've been taught are bad, unspiritual, or weak. So they push those feelings down. They don't express them. They don't even acknowledge them. But those feelings don't vanish. Instead, they leak out in passive-aggressive comments, in sudden explosions over minor things, in chronic resentment that poisons their relationships. Or they get projected onto others. Suddenly, everyone else seems angry and judgmental, while they remain the innocent victim. This is shadow projection. And it's one of the most common ways the mental habit of denial sabotages your life. Jung was crystal clear about this in his book, Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." That line should make you pause. The less you acknowledge your shadow, the more powerful it becomes. The more you try to be only good, only positive, only acceptable, the more you feed the monster in the basement. And that monster will have its day. It will sabotage your relationships, your career, your health, your peace of mind. Not because it's evil, but because it's starving for recognition. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so I need to acknowledge my shadow. But how do you even know what's in there? Jung had a brilliant answer to this. Look at what triggers you. Look at what you can't stand in other people. That intense reaction you have when someone is arrogant or weak or manipulative or too emotional, that's probably your shadow knocking on the door. Jung called this projection, and he considered it one of the primary ways the unconscious communicates with us. He said in Psychology and Religion, projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Read that again. The world you see is often just a mirror of what you refuse to see in yourself. I worked with someone once who couldn't stand people she called fake. She would go on and on about how she valued authenticity, how she could spot a phony from a mile away. But as we talked more, something else emerged. She had spent her entire life performing, saying what people wanted to hear, molding herself to fit expectations. Her hatred of fakeness in others was actually her shadow screaming about her own inauthenticity. Once she saw this, once she stopped projecting and started owning her own tendency to perform, everything shifted. Her relationships deepened, her anxiety decreased. She started making choices based on what she actually wanted, not what would make her look good. This is the power of shadow work, and it's exactly what Jung was pointing to. But here's where most people get stuck. They think shadow work means becoming your worst impulses. If I acknowledge my anger, won't I become violent? If I admit my selfishness, won't I become a terrible person? This is a fundamental misunderstanding of Jung's teaching. Acknowledging your shadow doesn't mean acting it out. It means bringing it into consciousness so it stops acting you out. There's a massive difference. When you're unconscious of your anger, it controls you. It erupts at inappropriate times. It damages relationships. It eats you alive from the inside. But when you acknowledge it, when you say, yes, I have anger, I have selfishness, I have dark thoughts, then you gain choice. You can feel the anger without becoming violent. You can notice the selfish impulse without acting on it. Consciousness creates space, and in that space you become free. Jung spent years studying alchemy, and he saw it as a metaphor for psychological transformation. The alchemists talked about turning lead into gold, but Jung understood this as the process of integrating the shadow, of transforming the base material of the psyche into something precious. He wrote about this extensively in Psychology and Alchemy and Mysterium Coniunctionis. The process isn't pretty. It involves facing everything you've been running from. But the result is what Jung called individuation, becoming a whole person rather than a fragmented collection of personas and shadows. And individuation, according to Jung, is the primary task of the second half of life. Here's something most people don't realize. Jung believed that the mental habit of repression and denial doesn't just hurt you psychologically, it makes you physically sick. He was one of the first to recognize what we now call psychosomatic illness, the way unresolved psychological conflicts manifest as physical symptoms. In The Practice of Psychotherapy, he noted that many of his patients' physical ailments had psychological roots. The migraine that won't go away, the chronic back pain, the digestive issues, the fatigue that no doctor can explain. Often these are the body's way of expressing what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Your shadow doesn't just live in your thoughts, it lives in your cells, and it will get your attention one way or another. Think about how much energy it takes to maintain a false self. Every day you wake up and put on the mask. You monitor your words, you control your expressions, you make sure nothing unacceptable slips through. It's exhausting. Jung called this provisional life, living as if your real life hasn't started yet, as if you're just waiting for permission to be yourself. But that permission never comes from outside, it can only come from within, and it requires the courage to face what you've been avoiding. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And he was right. It is terrifying, because accepting yourself completely means accepting the parts you've labeled as bad, wrong, shameful, unlovable. Let me tell you about another pattern Jung identified, one that's especially relevant today. He noticed that people who over-identify with being good, moral, and righteous often have the darkest shadows. The more you insist on your own virtue, the more you're probably compensating for something you can't admit. Jung saw this in religious communities, in political movements, in any group that defines itself by its moral superiority. He called it inflation, the identification with an archetype that makes you feel above human weakness. And inflation always leads to a fall, because the shadow always gets its revenge. The crusader against sin who gets caught in scandal. The champion of family values with a secret second life. The wellness guru who's secretly falling apart. These aren't random hypocrisies. They're the inevitable result of denying your shadow. Now here's a question worth sitting with. What part of yourself are you most ashamed of? What thought or feeling or desire do you work hardest to keep hidden, even from yourself? Because that's where your power is trapped. Jung believed that the gold is in the shadow. The creativity you've suppressed because it wasn't practical, the anger you've swallowed because it wasn't nice, the wildness you've tamed because it wasn't professional. All of that energy is still there, waiting to be reclaimed. But you can't reclaim it until you're willing to look at it without judgment. Jung had a concept he called enantiodromia, which he borrowed from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus. It means the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when pushed to an extreme. The person who's obsessively controlled eventually has a breakdown into chaos. The person who's relentlessly positive eventually crashes into depression. The person who denies all aggression eventually explodes in rage. Jung saw this pattern throughout history and in individual lives. He wrote about it in Psychological Types, explaining how one-sided development always invites its opposite. The mental habit of pushing too hard in one direction guarantees you'll eventually snap back the other way. Balance isn't optional, it's a law of the psyche. Here's what makes this so insidious. The mental habit of living from the persona and denying the shadow feels right. It feels like you're being a good person, a responsible adult, a functioning member of society. You get rewarded for it. People praise you for being so positive, so kind, so together. But underneath, the pressure builds. The unlived life accumulates like debt, and eventually the bill comes due. Jung saw countless people in midlife crisis, not because they'd failed, but because they'd succeeded at living someone else's version of success. They'd climbed the ladder only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall, and by then, the true self felt so foreign, so buried, that finding it again required a complete dismantling of the life they'd built. In The Development of Personality, Jung made a statement that still gives me chills. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Think about that phrasing. It's a privilege, meaning not everyone gets there. Not everyone has the courage. Most people die with their true self still locked away, still waiting for permission to emerge. And that's the ultimate tragedy, not that you suffered, but that you never fully lived, that you spent your whole life as an extra in someone else's movie rather than the protagonist of your own story. So how do you break this habit? How do you start living from authenticity rather than performance? Jung's answer was simple, but not easy. Make the unconscious conscious. And he offered several methods. Dream work was central to his approach. He believed dreams are messages from the unconscious, showing you what you're not seeing in waking life. In Man and His Symbols, he explained how dream symbols reveal the hidden dynamics of your psyche. That recurring dream where you're unprepared for an exam. That's not about school. It's about areas of your life where you feel unprepared, inadequate, exposed. The dream where you're being chased. That's your shadow, the parts of yourself you're running from. Start paying attention to your dreams. Write them down. Look for patterns. They're a direct line to the truth you're avoiding. Another method Jung used was active imagination, a technique where you dialogue with figures from your unconscious. It sounds strange, but it's remarkably powerful. You might imagine a conversation with the critical voice in your head, or with the part of you that's afraid, or with a dream character. You let them speak, and you listen without judgment. Through this process, you start to integrate the split-off parts of yourself. You start to realize that the voice you thought was you is just one voice among many, and that there's a deeper center, what Jung called the self with a capital S, that can hold all these contradictions. Jung also emphasized the importance of solitude. In our hyper-connected world, we rarely give ourselves space to just be, without input, without distraction, without the constant pressure to perform. But it's in solitude that the true self emerges. It's in silence that you hear the whispers underneath the noise. Jung himself would retreat to his tower in Bollingen, a place where he could work with stone, paint, think, and let his unconscious speak. He understood that transformation requires withdrawal from the collective, at least temporarily. You can't find yourself in the crowd. You have to be willing to step away, to risk being misunderstood, to stop performing long enough to discover what's real. Here's something crucial that Jung understood about psychological growth. It's not linear. It's not about getting better and better until you're perfect. It's cyclical. You'll make progress, then regress. You'll have insights, then forget them. You'll integrate a piece of shadow, then discover there's more. This isn't failure. This is the nature of the work. Jung called it circumambulation, walking around the center, spiraling deeper with each pass. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, he described how the process of individuation involves repeatedly encountering the same issues at deeper levels. Each time you think you've solved something, it comes back in a new form, asking you to go deeper. This can be frustrating, but it's also liberating. It means you're not broken when you struggle. You're human, and you're doing the work. One of the most practical pieces of advice Jung gave was to pay attention to your symptoms. Depression, anxiety, addiction, relationship problems. These aren't just things to fix or medicate away. They're messengers. They're telling you that something in your psyche needs attention. Jung would ask, what is this symptom protecting you from? What would you have to face if it went away? Often the symptom is actually serving a function, keeping you safe from a deeper truth you're not ready to confront. The anxiety that keeps you from taking risks might be protecting you from the fear of your own power. The depression that keeps you small might be protecting you from the responsibility of living fully. This doesn't mean symptoms aren't real or don't need treatment. It means they deserve curiosity rather than just suppression. Jung also talked about something he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to create new possibilities by holding opposites in tension. When you can sit with contradiction, when you can feel both love and hate, both confidence and doubt, both desire and fear, without needing to resolve it immediately, something new emerges. a third way, a creative solution, a more integrated perspective. But most of us can't tolerate that tension. We rush to pick a side, to be one thing, to eliminate the discomfort. And in doing so, we eliminate the possibility of transformation. Jung wrote about this extensively in his essay, The Transcendent Function, explaining how this capacity is essential for psychological growth. It's not about being wishy-washy or indecisive. It's about being spacious enough to hold complexity. Let me bring this back to something concrete. Right now, in your life, there's probably an area where you're performing rather than being authentic. Maybe it's at work, where you pretend to care about things you don't actually care about. Maybe it's in your relationship, where you've molded yourself to keep the peace. Maybe it's on social media, where you curate an image that has less and less to do with who you actually are. Whatever it is, that's where your energy is leaking. That's where the mental habit of denial is sabotaging your life. And the scary thing is, it feels normal. It feels like that's just how life is. But Jung would say, no, that's not how life has to be. That's how life is when you're living from the persona instead of the self. The path Jung outlined isn't about becoming something new. It's about uncovering what's already there. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his autobiography, he described his own journey of discovery, including his confrontation with his own unconscious, which was so intense it nearly drove him mad. But through that confrontation, he discovered the concepts that would define his work and help millions of people. He learned that the psyche has its own wisdom, its own direction, and that your job isn't to control it, but to cooperate with it, to listen to it. To trust that the symptoms, the dreams, the slip-ups, the attractions and repulsions are all information, all guidance toward wholeness. Here's a hard truth Jung would want you to hear. The mental habit that's sabotaging your life isn't going to change because you read something or heard something or understood something intellectually. Insight is just the beginning. The real work is in the daily practice of catching yourself in the act of performing, of denying, of projecting. It's in the moment when you feel that familiar anger rising, and instead of pushing it down or exploding, you pause, you breathe, you acknowledge it, you ask what it's trying to tell you. It's in the moment when you're about to say yes to something you want to say no to, and you stop. You feel the fear of disappointing someone. You do it anyway. This is how you reclaim yourself, one small act of authenticity at a time. Jung believed that the second half of life is for this work. The first half is for building the ego, establishing yourself in the world, achieving things. But if you don't shift in the second half, if you keep playing the same game, you'll end up bitter, rigid, or empty. The second half is for asking deeper questions. Not what do I want to achieve, but who do I want to become? Not how do I look to others, but who am I when no one's watching? These questions require courage because they don't have neat answers. They require you to sit with uncertainty, to let go of the identities you've worked so hard to build, to die psychologically so something more real can be born. There's a concept in Jungian psychology called the death and rebirth cycle. You can't transform without letting something die. The old persona, the false self, the protective mechanisms that once served you but now imprison you, they have to die. And that feels like death. It feels like you're losing yourself. But what you're actually losing is what was never really you in the first place. What emerges on the other side is what Jung called the individuated self, a person who's integrated their shadow, who's in relationship with their unconscious, who can be fully human without apology. That's the goal, not perfection, not enlightenment, just wholeness. Jung also recognized something that's incredibly relevant today. He saw that modern society, with its emphasis on rationality, productivity, and surface-level success, was cutting people off from their inner lives. We've become experts at doing, but we've forgotten how to be. We've mastered the external world, but lost touch with the internal one. And the cost is epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, addiction, and meaninglessness. Jung predicted this in his writings from nearly a century ago. In The Undiscovered Self, he warned about the dangers of mass society and the loss of individual consciousness. He saw that when people lose touch with their inner depths, they become vulnerable to collective movements, to ideology, to anything that promises to fill the void. The mental habit that sabotages your life isn't just personal, it's cultural. We're trained from childhood to prioritize how we appear over how we feel, to value achievement over authenticity, to fit in rather than stand out. And then we wonder why we feel disconnected, why relationships feel shallow, why success feels empty. Jung would say it's because you've abandoned yourself. You've traded your soul for social approval. And no amount of external validation can fill that void because the void is internal. It's the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be. So what's the alternative? Jung's vision was radical for his time and still is today. He believed each person has a unique path, a unique purpose that can only be discovered by turning inward. Not by following someone else's rules or religion or philosophy, but by doing the hard work of self-discovery. He called this individuation, and he saw it as both a psychological process and a spiritual one. It's psychological because it involves integrating the parts of your psyche. It's spiritual because it connects you to something larger than your ego, what he called the self, the central archetype that organizes the whole personality. This isn't about religion in the traditional sense. It's about recognizing that you're part of something bigger, that your life has meaning beyond your personal success or failure. Jung had tremendous respect for religious traditions because he understood they were attempts to deal with the same psychological realities he was exploring scientifically. Myths, rituals, symbols, these aren't primitive superstitions. They're expressions of universal patterns in the human psyche, what Jung called archetypes. The hero's journey, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, these figures appear across cultures and throughout history because they represent fundamental structures of consciousness. When you understand this, you realize that your personal struggles aren't just yours, they're human. You're living out ancient patterns, and there's actually comfort in that. You're not alone. You're not broken. You're participating in the eternal human drama of becoming conscious. But here's where Jung differs from a lot of spiritual teaching. He didn't believe in transcending the ego or getting rid of the shadow. He believed in integrating them. The ego isn't the enemy, it's necessary. You need a strong ego to do shadow work. Without it, you just dissolve into chaos. And the shadow isn't something to eliminate, it's something to befriend, to learn from, to integrate. Jung's path is one of radical acceptance, not in the sense of complacency, but in the sense of acknowledging what is, all of it, the light and the dark, the noble and the petty, the beautiful and the ugly. When you can hold all of that without judgment, when you can say this is all me, then you're free. I want to circle back to where we started, that man in his 40s who felt hollow despite his success. After years of work with Jung, something shifted. He didn't leave his career or his family. He didn't make some dramatic external change. But internally, everything was different. He started making small choices based on what he actually wanted, not what he thought he should want. He started expressing feelings he'd always suppressed. He started pursuing interests he'd dismissed as impractical. And slowly, that sense of hollowness filled in. Not with achievement or approval, but with presence, with aliveness, with the simple satisfaction of being himself. That's what Jung's work offers. Not a better mask, but the courage to take the mask off. This is the vision Jung revealed. The mental habit that sabotages your life is the habit of self-abandonment, of living from the outside in rather than the inside out, of prioritizing persona over authenticity, of denying your shadow rather than integrating it. And the solution isn't a technique or a practice, though those help. The solution is a fundamental shift in how you relate to yourself, from judgment to curiosity, from control to cooperation, from performance to presence. It's the shift from asking, "What do others want from me?" to asking, "What does my soul want from me?" That's the question Jung believed everyone must eventually face, and the answer can only come from within. Now, this is Jung's perspective, a psychological and philosophical framework developed through decades of clinical work and personal exploration. It's not the only way to understand human behavior or the path to fulfillment. Other traditions and thinkers offer different maps, different methods, different truths. Jung himself would say that no single approach works for everyone, that each person must find their own way. But what Jung offers is a powerful lens for understanding why, despite all our efforts, despite all our achievements, we so often feel like something's missing. He points to that invisible habit, that automatic pattern of denial and performance, and he says, "Look, this is what's running your life, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you have a choice. Keep living the same way, or do the terrifying, liberating work of becoming who you actually are." So here's what I want to know. What part of yourself have you been hiding, even from yourself? What would it look like to stop performing and start being real? And what scares you most about that possibility? Think about it. Sit with it. Because those questions are the beginning of the journey Jung mapped out, the journey from persona to self, from fragmentation to wholeness, from living someone else's life to finally, courageously living your own. If this exploration opened something up for you, if it touched on something you've been feeling but couldn't name, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Share what resonated, what challenged you, what you're thinking about differently now. And if you found value in this deep dive into Jung's teachings, hit that like button and subscribe so we can continue exploring these profound ideas together. This is just one perspective, one map of the human psyche, but it's a map that's helped countless people find their way home to themselves. And maybe it can help you too.